Hello and welcome to our weekly discussion about issues of importance in the Caucasus. I'm Dr. Joanne Lisosky, author and journalism educator. Today we are talking to Paul A. Goble, former special advisor to the Secretary of State in the U.S. and former senior advisor to the director of the Voice of America. He's an expert on Russia and other Eurasian issues. Now, we've been following the war in Nagorno Karabakh for 18 days now, Paul. We've seen attempts at ceasefire brokered by the Russians and then almost immediately broken by Armenia. What was the underlying goal of this strategy from a Russian perspective?
Well, I think that the Russians did not want either side to win. It was very important to them that the Azerbaijanis not win. They were quite prepared to see Armenia punished, given their differences with the current government in Yerevan. But they were not prepared to see Azerbaijan win. If Azerbaijan had won, it's entirely possible that Russia would have seen its influence in the South Caucasus evaporate. Russia has maintained its role there primarily by playing one country off against another. A wise Azerbaijani commentator once observed that in the South Caucasus, from Russia's point of view, Georgia is the tool, Armenia is the way, and Azerbaijan is the prize. Russia would be happy to see Azerbaijan win, but only if Azerbaijan were prepared to become a client state to the Russian Federation. That isn't going to happen, so we're going to continue to see Russia try to play now one side, now the other. With respect to the end of the war, I think it's important to understand the difference between a ceasefire that just simply takes a certain amount of time to go into effect and a longer term stable situation and a peace. So far, no one has proposed a peace. What people have talked about is going back to a more stable ceasefire. A peace is when both sides walk away thinking they've won something, or alternatively, that one side has won so completely that the other side has no choice but to withdraw. What we've seen in the South Caucasus since the 80s has been a conflict in which that no one has gone beyond at best an armistice, which will be renewed when one or the other side can.
Now, historically, do you think that the Soviets wanted to foment this conflict in the 1980s? Was it in their best interest to have this conflict
Well, I think
happen?
I think that you have to put that question really needs to be divided. On the one hand, Moscow was very interested in maintaining tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That was done by the way the borders were drawn, the non-contiguous Nakhchivan autonomy for Azerbaijan, separated from Azerbaijan proper by an Armenian land bridge, Zengezur in the Armenian name, and a Armenian area that was a minority, but within Azerbaijan and under Azerbaijani control. That's a recipe for creating tension. It's one thing to want tensions. It's another thing to want violence. I think there was no question that the Gorbachev government, like its predecessors, was interested in continuing the tensions between the two. I think it was very much the case that Gorbachev and his government did not want to see the violence emerge that it did, because it forced Moscow to deal with the fact that the only way it could stop it was the introduction of military force, and using military force in what was at that time a domestic environment raised the question of what Moscow might have to do elsewhere. So I think, yes, Moscow wanted the tensions. No, Moscow didn't want the violence.
So the Azeris that I've talked to seemed shocked by the sudden Moscow deal and the sudden emergence of Moscow into this conflict for the first time in almost 30 years. After the Azeris were finally restoring their territorial integrity, freeing occupied lands, why would Moscow sort of turn, it seems that turned a little bit on Azerbaijan at this time?
Well, I think that Moscow could have stopped this conflict very, very quickly if it had come in on the side of Armenia and made it clear that it was going to use Russian force to defend the Armenian position. That would have brought an end to the conflict much sooner. What Russia wanted was for Azerbaijan to advance sufficiently to punish the government in Yerevan, which Moscow doesn't particularly like, but not go so far that Moscow would lose its ability to play the two off against each other, and also not go so far that Baku could think seriously about not only recovering all of Karabakh and the adjoining districts of Azerbaijan that have been occupied by Armenia, but also Zengezur, the land bridge between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan. That's an incredibly sensitive thing for Russians, because if that land bridge were to be recovered by Azerbaijan, there would be a direct land line from Turkey to Baku, and thence, of course, to Central Asia. The fact that the Turks were involved in this in terms of being enthusiastically supportive of Baku's position only made Moscow more nervous. So again, Azerbaijan did advance. It did retake some areas that had been occupied, but it didn't retake all of them. There's an awful lot that's still under Armenian military control. That being the case, Moscow can continue to play its divide and rule politics. The more interesting question is, why did Baku agree at this point? I think there are two reasons for that. The first is that I think Azerbaijan achieved what it wanted to do in this cycle, and knew that it risked the involvement of Russian forces against it if it went further. And it also had to look south, because Iran very much wanted an end to the conflict. And the issue of southern Azerbaijan and Iran's relationship with the Azeri minority there is one that Baku has to be sensitive to as well. So I think what we've seen is what I would expect, that Azerbaijan thought it had changed the negotiating table, if you will, the shape of it, and that it's willing to go back to a more stable situation, but that getting to that point, once you sign an agreement, and please remember, this agreement that Moscow brokered isn't much of an agreement. It says we'll have a ceasefire, and then we'll decide what it looks like in subsequent negotiations. Well, forgive me, you either know what it's going to look like or you don't. By having that provision, which is number 2 in the list of provisions in the agreement, what you're inviting both Azerbaijan and Armenia to do is to try to create facts on the ground that will go into that subsequent agreement. I personally have expected, since the ceasefire was announced about a week ago, that it would take 5 to 10 days for this to calm down. Wars may start quickly, but they rarely end quickly. And this is typical. The question is, how long will this go on? It's gone on a bit longer, at least the level of intensity, than I expected, but not so much longer that I don't believe we're going. I remain convinced we're going to get back to a new frozen conflict, if you will, that will be unfrozen at some point in the months or years ahead. Both countries have assets, but both countries have limited assets, and they know that if either one does something, the other will be helped or constrained by outside powers. The three that matter most, of course, are Russia, Turkey, and Iran. The West Europeans and the Americans will issue statements of concern and calls for a ceasefire. More than that, I don't see them doing.
I admire your optimism that this will be frozen again. I appreciate that so much.
Only for a couple of, but only perhaps for 6 months. I mean, the point is, this is going to go on until there is some kind of a settlement. There are ways that this could be solved. There is no willingness in the international community to support any of those ways because Russia is chair of the Minsk Group, and I'm an opponent of the Minsk Group. I think the Minsk Group was a recipe for keeping this conflict going forever, and I think Russia intends to use it that way. I think there are things that could be done. It is going to be the longer this goes on, two things become true. The more difficult it will be to get a result without violence, and ultimately the more likely that Azerbaijan wins. Because Azerbaijan is bigger, wealthier, and has an army that has better weaponry and better training. And unless the Russians are prepared to fight that, and I don't think they are given Turkey and Iran, I think that means that over time, Azerbaijan wins. But Azerbaijan also has limited resources in any finite period, and therefore is going to go for a while, advance for a while, stop, advance again. I don't think one is optimistic by saying we'll see a lessening of the fighting for weeks or months, but then we'll see a new wave of fighting again. This is what's been going on there for 3 decades. And I think that it's a mistake to confuse armistices and peaces and frozen conflicts. Those are 3 very different things. And that, unfortunately, much of the media in Moscow, the West, and to a certain extent in Baku and Yerevan as well, confuses those things. A ceasefire is not a peace. And we've got to stop acting as if it were. Sometimes a ceasefire can be a useful step to peace. Not always, but sometimes it can.
I understand yesterday there was a phone call between Mr. Putin and Mr. Erdogan. Mm-hmm. What do you think was discussed in that phone call, if you were listening in?
Turkey is an increasingly important player in this part of the world, and Russia has to be worried about at least 2 things the Turks can do. The first is that they can, of course, close the straits, which is the historical issue in this part of the world. The second, however, is that they can block the pipelines. And if they do either of those things, Russia is hurt. So Russia is, the Kremlin is feeling out what Moscow has to do to avoid having that occur. And it's a very complicated negotiation. Erdogan is many things, but he is a canny negotiator. And he knows that right now he has a lot of the high cards in his hand, and that Putin is the one who has to come to terms with him more than the other way around. That's also being played out in Baku and in the relationship between Ankara and Baku. And Yerevan knows it. As I say, I can't tell you why it is that Baku agreed to Moscow all of a sudden, although I do believe that it had something to do with north-south trade between Iran and Russia and going through Azerbaijan.
I want to talk a little bit about the civilians being targeted in Azerbaijan. That seems especially egregious to me. It's the worst fighting since 1994, and most significant are the bombings of civilian targets. 10 were killed earlier in Ganja, and yesterday a funeral was targeted. 3 were killed. It also was revealed that these were Russian-made rockets used by the Armenian forces. How does this change that balance of power?
Well, I want to know when Armenia used a weapon that wasn't manufactured in the Russian Federation. I mean, the fact is, any day of this conflict, if one said a Russian-made weapon was used against Azerbaijan, that would be true. This is not new. The only thing that's new, apparently, is that Russia is not prohibiting the Armenians from using weapon systems that supply them. That's what's new, not that Armenia is getting its weapons from somewhere else. The issue, however, of targeting civilians is a complicated one because it's in a war that's being fought to recover villages. And let's remember that this war has been about fighting to take back this or that village. Well, this is almost like fighting in a city. The distance between armed forces in uniform and civilian populations is not nearly as great as we would think of in sort of the classical military operations. Some of what has been done looks like it was intentionally targeting civilians. Some of it looks like the kind of collateral damage that unfortunately you get in this kind of a conflict. Separating that out is very, very difficult.
So you don't see it as being independently verified at this point, then, that they're purposely targeting civilians?
If we have dead civilians in Ganja or in Gudrut or one of these villages, we have dead civilians. Is that a tragedy? Yes. Is it morally objectionable? Yes. Can we say with any degree of certainty that they targeted civilians as opposed to targeting a military target? I think the Ganja thing is pretty clear that this was an act against civilians. I think some of the attacks in the villages, it gets murkier. That, in other words, if you send in a rocket against military forces which are based in a village, the odds are good that you will kill both soldiers and civilians. I think it's going to be very tough in some of these cases to separate that out. Ganja, not so hard. But I think we have to be very, very careful here, because otherwise there's a tendency to treat all in a category. And at least from what I can see from this distance, I don't know that. I don't have enough evidence to prove that. The fact that we have dead civilians is absolutely true. The question of intent is something that has to be established by with a degree of certainty that I don't have.
Regarding the Russian-made bombs, you said that Russia at this point is not telling Armenia not to use Russian-made bombs.
I think that's what we can conclude from that. When the Russians provide weapons to Armenia, they presumably have some of those weapons are under Armenian control, and Armenia can do with them what they like. Other weapons that the Russians provide the Armenians can be used only if the Russians don't ban that, if they don't prohibit it. I would guess that with the continuing violence, the Russians decided that some of the weapons that they have key control, if you want, they would allow the Armenians to make that choice.
Has there ever been any evidence of Russians selling arms or giving arms to other countries where they have told them, please don't use these against...
No, they don't ever say please.
Okay, I imagine that.
It's a condition of sale. I mean,
okay.
that if or you give weapons to a country and you say, these are weapons that you can use at your own discretion, these are weapons that we want some control over. That's been true across the CIS, or at least the ODNK.
So as far as the U.S. involvement, you said there's sort of just issuing statements, but I believe the statement, I think it was yesterday from Joe Biden, was pretty much handing over Nagorno Karabakh to Armenia and making
He's not an official.
But
and I said
what
the
do you
United
think?
States.
What was the
If you ask me what his policy is likely to be, should he be elected, we can talk about that. But he's not. He doesn't speak for the United States government just yet.
So his strategy is more or less to just put a pin in President Trump at this point, or just make everyone think that he knows something about international conflicts?
He got a question and he responded.
Okay.
Nobody likes violence. I mean, being against violence is like being for motherhood. It doesn't go much further than that. Addressing the issue in the Southern Caucasus of who controls what and whose land is correct and what the balance should be between state sovereignty and the right of nations to self-determination would require an investment of American effort that we haven't been willing to make. And I think many people in the United States hoped that this war would somehow just go away, that the Azerbaijanis would give up, the Armenians would dig in, that this settlement, which the international community seems to think would work, meaning that all of the occupied territory except NK gets returned to Azerbaijan, Armenia gets to keep NK, plus the corridor between Armenia proper and Nagorno Karabakh. The problem with that, and it's been a problem since 1991, 1989, is that for people in Yerevan and for people in Baku, the question of occupied territories, of these territories, is at the center of their national lives. For most of the period since 1989, the people in power in Baku have been people who trace their ancestry to Nakhchivan. For most of the same period, the people in Yerevan trace their ancestry back to Karabakh. Given that, these are not issues that are going to go away by the measures that the international community and the Minsk group have proposed. People are not willing to be serious about just how central that territory is to the national understanding of the elites and populations in both Armenia and Azerbaijan. We have a serious problem here, because this is something that is who we are. Being Azerbaijani means this. Being Armenian means this. And those definitions are in conflict, and they are in conflict over a particular piece of territory. The solutions, quote unquote solutions that have been offered, aren't solutions because they don't address that. I'm the author, infamously, of the Goble plan of 30 years ago, in which I suggested that there should be a swap, namely that Azerbaijan should get Zangezur and Armenia should get Karabakh, on the assumption that the Armenians were never going to give up Karabakh voluntarily, because they feel they've been in retreat historically for 500 years anyway. The image of the 40 days of Musa Dagh is the core of who and what they think of the world, and the Azerbaijanis are not going to give it up ever unless they get something they want at least as much. And so that was my great idea, which terrified people, because somehow it's not as bad to force people to move or to have continuing war in which people die than to redraw borders. I understand that, but it's not my own view. I think now something is going to have to be done about an economic condominium not a political one, an economic condominium. But I don't think right now there is a sufficient willingness on the part of the West, which would have to play a key role in this, to get us there. And that being so, I expect this war to go on for a very long time.
So you're saying the personal is political and the political is personal?
Of course. I mean,
and you're talking.
I'm sorry.
You're talking about a possible economic way of fixing this, paying people to go home or to stop?
No. What I mean by an economic condominium is this. The international community, despite evidence to the contrary, seems to think that the borders of republics that existed in 1991 were eternal, which is nonsense. The republic borders were changed more than 200 times during the Soviet era. So the idea that they were stable forever and God-given is ridiculous. But that's what people nonetheless believe. Mainly they believe it because of their own convenience. They don't want to deal with the messiness. And it's not just in Armenia and Azerbaijan. There are a whole bunch of places where it's messy. I suggest people should take a look at Karakalpak, the Karakalpak issue between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, but never mind. What I mean is this. I think the only way that I can imagine this conflict being resolved so that you might have a chance for long-term peace would be one in which Azerbaijan would reclaim sovereignty, political sovereignty. In other words, this is our territory, only our soldiers can be there, but that it would take steps to integrate Armenia and Karabakh economically in East-West trade, going from Baku to Turkey, so that Armenia would have a chance to develop. Otherwise, it won't. It'll be simply a Russian dependency forever. And so that the people of Karabakh and the people of Armenia would be better off, and our Azerbaijan would be able to have its population move between Karabakh, or between Azerbaijan proper and Nakhchivan without having to go through Iran. I mean, one of the things that people forget is an Azerbaijani who wants to go from Baku to Nakhchivan and gets on a bus has to go through Iran and has to get an Iranian visa, okay? It would be a very big deal if there could be an agreement that would allow Azerbaijanis to go to Nakhchivan on the ground north of the Araks. It would be a very big deal if railroads going from Baku west would go through Karabakh and Yerevan. That would require an enormous amount of money. It would require an enormous sensitivity to things. But if you start from the proposition that the identities of these two peoples are not going to change, then you have to do something that supports their identity, but doesn't create a situation where they will continue to fight. That's my current thinking of what might be possible. I can imagine how you'd get there, but I also know that it would require the West being willing to stand up against Russian interference. It would require a different relationship between the EU, the US, and Iran than currently exists. It would require the integration of Turkey back into the West in ways that the Turks have become more independent-minded. Could it be done? Yes. Is it easy? No. Whoever does it will get a Nobel Prize.
Well, it's a fascinating strategy that I haven't heard before, so I really appreciate that.
Well, it's because I take identity seriously. As long as Armenians and Azerbaijanis are invested in this place, it's not going to. This didn't happen in 1989. Mm-hmm. This is not about Sumgait. This is not about Shusha. This is about understanding who and what we are. People don't seem to remember that 150 years ago, Baku, Tbilisi then, and Yerevan were all Armenian cities, surrounded by people who weren't.
Mm-hmm.
And what that meant is what we've seen is a sorting out of populations.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit, excuse me,
sure, sorry.
Mr. Goble. I want to ask you a little bit about the populations. You hear little in the West about the internally displaced persons in Azerbaijan, and there are no internally displaced persons in Armenia. Can you offer more insight into that? Why isn't the West hearing more about that?
Well, the West, as I said, isn't paying much attention. There were 1 million IDPs, Azerbaijani IDPs, both from the war zone itself and also from Armenia. Because there were Azerbaijanis in the Armenian SSR, and they left. There were some Armenians in Azerbaijan, a very small number, who left and went in the other direction. So it's not true that there are no Armenian IDPs. It's just that their numbers are very small in comparison. I think what happened in '91 is the West proclaimed victory and decided it could take a vacation, and that was a huge mistake. And it allowed things to grow. I visited the refugee camps in Azerbaijan. I even wrote the introduction to the Azerbaijani government's book on refugees, Eyes That Have Seen Too Much. The title was mine. That was the title of my introduction, which they took and used for the book. You can't go there and not be shaken by what's been done. And having a generation or two live in a refugee camp is, from everything we know everywhere else in the world, a recipe for disaster. You want to integrate those people. You want to bring them home. The problem is that the West tended to take the position that Baku should integrate them into Baku society rather than have them go home. Azerbaijan saw they're not being integrated as a card it had to try to force the West to address the issue of control of the Karabakh territory. So
along the same line, given your experience with Voice of America and the whole idea that today's wars are fought often with words and propaganda, propaganda warfare, who is mastering this strategy of propaganda? It makes me think of the internally displaced persons not being witnessed or heard about, that someone is missing an opportunity to explain that to the West.
Well, I think that the Azerbaijani government has not done nearly as much as it should do to bring the attention to the world. I think the book, Eyes Which Have Seen Too Much, is something that ought to be handed out to people in the Congress, to people in the media. I think that's an utter failure. I mean, I don't want to be criticizing just one side, but the fact is that the Armenians are very much better at presenting their story than the Azerbaijanis are in presenting theirs. And that's been true for a very long time. Recently, Armenians have assumed a much higher role in Western countries, France and the United States in particular, than Azeris have. But the Azeris have advantage. They have some real advantages if they would take time to focus on them. The thing that one needs to understand about international communication is that it's not like selling soap. It's not like you get people to buy a bar of soap by having an ad on TV. It's a long-term process. It's an education process. It's a creation of images that dominate how people approach a problem for decades. That doesn't happen by a single advertisement or a single campaign. It happens because you get up and you do something to communicate this every day, again and again and again and again and again for years. Willingness to do that, unfortunately, is in short supply in some countries, my own among others.
What about the idea of peacekeepers being kept away from the conflict zone? I've heard that the Azerbaijani president voices protests against any peacekeepers. Why do you think that is? Wouldn't that be more of a good piece of propaganda to spread or information to spread?
The fact is, Russian peacekeepers are peacekeepers, but they spell it differently, not P-E-A-C-E, but P-I-E-C-E. If the Russian troops go in there, they will remain. They will not be peacekeepers, they will be controllers. Okay, that's a reality. Baku has to object to that. I would be in favor, and if I had been asked my opinion by the people in Baku, I would have said, we of course favor peacekeepers, but they should be international peacekeepers who aren't participants in the process. And the Russians are part of the process. If you're going to put peacekeepers somewhere, you don't put people who are engaged in the process. And those are two very different things. Azerbaijan didn't play it well. They should have said, of course we're for peacekeepers. We just don't want peacekeepers from a country that has demonstrated again and again and again that it's on one side of the conflict. Just as Armenia would not be willing to accept peacekeepers from Turkey, Azerbaijan isn't willing to accept peacekeepers from Russia.
Mr. Goble, you've been very good at giving clear insights and a possible long-term solution. Finally, what is the next small step that you suggest can be taken to sort of mitigate this conflict?
Well, I think the most important thing is for people to recognize how complicated this is, that it didn't start yesterday, it didn't start 30 years ago, it goes back a millennium. And to realize that solving it, in other words, getting a peace as opposed to a ceasefire or an armistice, is going to be very, very difficult, very, very expensive, and going to require a lot of effort. But that if that effort is not made, not only Azerbaijan and Armenia will suffer, but many other people will as well. Just as the refugee camps elsewhere have given rise to the Islamic State, refugee camps in Azerbaijan can give rise to people who will go on and undermine governments and civilizations elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paul Goble, expert on Russia and Eurasian issues and former special advisor to Secretary of State in the U.S. and former senior advisor to the Director of Voice of America. Thank you. I hope we can have you back again sometime soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
You too.